The biggest mistake a bully can make is believing the quiet man has already lost. The knock on my front door came at exactly 8:12 on a grey Tuesday morning, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the old cedar hallway my father built with his own hands almost 30 years ago. Before I even reached the handle, I caught the faint smell of fresh printer ink mixing with the aroma of the black coffee I'd left cooling on the kitchen counter. Outside stood a county deputy with a neutral expression, a thick envelope tucked beneath his arm, and behind him, parked just far enough away to look innocent, sat a pearl-white Lexus SUV glistening beneath the morning drizzle. Evelyn Brooks leaned casually against the driver's door, arms folded, wearing the kind of satisfied smile that only comes from believing you've already won. She never waved. She simply watched. The deputy handed me the documents, apologized with his eyes more than his words, and quietly explained that a foreclosure hearing had been scheduled after months of unpaid HOA assessments, accumulated penalties, legal expenses, and emergency compliance fees that somehow totaled more than some people paid for an entire year of mortgage payments. My fingers tightened around the envelope as cold wind carried the scent of wet grass across the porch. Every page felt heavier than the last. According to the paperwork, I had 14 days before I could lose the only house my family had ever owned. Evelyn slowly pushed herself away from her SUV and walked toward the edge of my driveway without ever stepping onto my property. Even then, she knew exactly where the survey markers were. "I told you this neighborhood had standards," she said, her voice smooth enough to sound polite to anyone passing by. "Some people just refuse to learn." Then she smiled again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to let me know she expected to watch everything I built disappear piece by piece. The tires of her Lexus rolled quietly across the damp pavement as she drove away, leaving nothing behind except silence and the faint smell of expensive perfume lingering in the cool air. I stood there for another minute listening to rainwater drip from the porch roof onto the cracked concrete steps my father had poured himself. Those steps had carried muddy work boots, birthday cakes, Christmas trees, moving boxes, and more memories than any appraisal could ever calculate. Losing this place had never been about property value. It meant losing the last physical piece of my family. Most people would probably assume that was the moment I finally broke. Honestly, I almost did. Over the previous 4 months, Evelyn had transformed my life into a relentless cycle of certified letters, violation notices, surprise inspections, attorney correspondence, anonymous complaints, and neighborhood rumors that spread faster than wildfire after a dry Texas summer. Every time I solved one problem, another appeared waiting in my mailbox before sunset. Friends stopped visiting because they didn't want their vehicles photographed. Contractors suddenly became unavailable after receiving mysterious warnings from the HOA board. Even delivery drivers started leaving packages at the curb instead of walking to my porch. My quiet life had somehow become public entertainment for an entire subdivision. And through all of it, I never raised my voice once. I never argued at board meetings. I never threatened anyone. I simply kept every envelope, every email, every voicemail, every security recording, every receipt, every timestamp, and every signature. Evelyn believed she was building a case against me. What she never realized was that every move she made was quietly building one for me instead. My name is Daniel Carter. I am 42 years old, and if you had driven past my house 6 months earlier, you would have assumed I was just another middle-aged homeowner trying to keep an old family property standing. Every Saturday morning began exactly the same way. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen while an old blues station crackled softly from the radio my father bought in 1994. I would carry my mug onto the back porch, listen to the wind moving through the oak trees, and watch the sunlight creep across the weathered fence that my father and I built together one summer when I was still in high school. Every nail in that fence reminded me of a lesson he believed was worth repeating. Build it right the first time, because fixing shortcuts always costs more. After he passed away 3 years earlier, that house became far more than a piece of real estate. It became the last place where I could still hear his laughter if the evening was quiet enough. The worn hardwood floors still creaked in the same places they had when I was 12 years old. The garage still carried the faint scent of cedar, machine oil, and old paint cans that had somehow survived every cleanup project we ever started. Most people spend their lives chasing bigger houses. I only wanted to protect the one that already meant everything to me. The neighborhood itself looked like something from a real estate brochure. Identical mailboxes lined every curb. Perfect green lawns stretched from sidewalk to sidewalk. Decorative flags fluttered in front of polished stone entryways. On the surface, it felt peaceful. Underneath, every conversation seemed to begin and end with the homeowners association. New residents quickly learned which flowers were approved, how tall hedges could grow, what color fences were acceptable, and exactly how quickly a warning letter could appear if someone decided you were no longer fitting the image of the community. I kept to myself. I waved when neighbors waved first. I helped an elderly couple replace their mailbox after a storm. I shoveled snow from driveways during winter without expecting anyone to notice. I never attended neighborhood parties because crowds had never interested me. Quiet had become comfortable. Privacy had become valuable. That was probably why Evelyn noticed me. People like her seemed uncomfortable around someone they could not easily categorize. She often drove slowly past my house in her white Lexus, never looking directly at me for more than a second, yet somehow always noticing every tiny detail. A trash can left outside an extra hour. Leaves gathering beneath the porch after heavy rain. A flower bed that had not yet been replanted for the season. Little things that normal people ignored somehow became official concerns under her watch. The first violation notice arrived only 12 days after I moved back into my father's house. Then another. Then another. At first I honestly believed someone had made an honest mistake. I paid the small fine, corrected the issue, and assumed life would return to normal. Instead, each correction only seemed to encourage another complaint. Looking back now, I understand something I completely missed back then. Evelyn Brooks was never trying to enforce neighborhood standards. She was testing how much pressure it would take before I reacted. What she could not possibly know was that patience had become my strongest habit long before either of us ever stepped into that neighborhood. I eventually realized that Evelyn Brooks did not simply manage the homeowners association. She managed perception. That was her real talent. Every smile, every compliment, every perfectly rehearsed greeting carried the same invisible message. She wanted people to believe she was protecting the neighborhood, when in reality she was carefully deciding who belonged and who did not. Every Thursday evening, the clubhouse parking lot filled with polished sport utility vehicles and luxury sedans while board members gathered beneath warm yellow lights that spilled through the tall front windows. You could smell fresh mulch from the flower beds long before you reached the entrance, mixed with expensive perfume and freshly brewed coffee sitting beside neatly arranged trays of cookies. On the surface, it looked like neighbors volunteering to improve their community. Sit through one meeting, however, and another picture slowly emerged. Evelyn always sat at the center of the long conference table with a leather binder positioned perfectly in front of her. Every page carried color-coded tabs. Every rule had been highlighted. Every conversation somehow ended with another regulation that justified another warning, another fee, or another committee review. She never raised her voice because she never needed to. The room adjusted itself around her. Board members nodded before she even finished speaking. New homeowners apologized before she finished asking questions. Contractors laughed politely at jokes that were not funny because everyone understood who approved neighborhood projects. Her influence reached far beyond monthly meetings. Local landscaping companies sought her recommendations. Realtors praised her for maintaining property values. Even the neighborhood newsletter read less like community updates and more like personal announcements celebrating whatever initiative Evelyn happened to support that month. She had built an image that was almost impossible to challenge without appearing unreasonable yourself. The first time I attended one of those meetings, I kept my comments respectful and brief. I simply asked why my violation notices continued arriving after every issue had already been corrected. Evelyn smiled warmly, folded her hands together, and thanked me for my concern as though I were asking about the weather. Then she explained to the room that maintaining standards required consistency and that every homeowner received equal treatment. Several neighbors nodded without looking in my direction. I noticed something else that evening. Every time someone questioned a decision, Evelyn redirected the conversation toward protecting the community instead of addressing the actual issue. It was subtle enough that most people never noticed. Facts became feelings. Documentation became attitude. Questions became signs of unwillingness to cooperate. Walking back to my truck afterward, I heard the soft crunch of gravel beneath my boots while a cool evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine from a nearby garden. An older gentleman named Harold quietly caught up beside me. Without making eye contact, he whispered, "Do yourself a favor. Pay whatever she asks. Life gets easier that way." Before I could answer, he simply kept walking toward his pickup truck as though the conversation had never happened. That single sentence stayed with me longer than any violation notice. Fear had become routine here. Not fear of crime or danger, but fear of paperwork, hearings, fines, and public embarrassment. Evelyn understood something many people overlooked. Most decent families would spend far more energy avoiding conflict than challenging unfair treatment. She counted on that. Every certified letter carried just enough legal language to sound intimidating. Every deadline felt urgent. Every meeting left homeowners wondering whether resisting was worth the stress. Looking back, I understand that she was never really trying to enforce rules. She was measuring obedience. The neighborhood had become her kingdom, the board her audience, and every homeowner another character expected to follow the script. She believed I would eventually do exactly what everyone else had done before me. Pay the fines, lower my head, and quietly disappear into the background. She had absolutely no reason to believe this story would end any differently. I stopped believing the violation notices were random the morning I found 3 separate envelopes waiting in my mailbox before 9 o'clock. The paper still felt cool from the early air, and the sharp scent of fresh ink hit me the moment I opened the first one. Unauthorized exterior storage. Landscaping deficiency. Failure to maintain architectural harmony. 3 different violations. 3 different deadlines. All photographed within the same 24-hour period. I looked around my property, trying to see what everyone else supposedly saw. My lawn had been cut 2 days earlier. My flower beds were freshly mulched. My trash cans were already back inside the garage. Nothing had changed except the growing stack of paperwork sitting on my kitchen table. Then the inspections became strangely precise. A warning arrived because a garden hose had remained connected to the outdoor faucet while I watered new shrubs during a heat wave. Another claimed my porch light emitted an unapproved color temperature after I replaced a burned-out bulb with the only model the local hardware store had in stock. One letter even suggested that the weathered finish on my mailbox reduced neighborhood aesthetics despite the fact that it had looked exactly the same since my father installed it years before. Every correction I made somehow generated another complaint. It felt less like following rules and more like chasing a finish line that moved every time I got close. The pressure slowly spread beyond my front yard. A contractor cancelled a scheduled roof inspection after quietly explaining that working with homeowners involved in ongoing disputes with the association often created unnecessary complications. A landscaping company suddenly became unavailable after confirming my appointment only 2 days earlier. Even a delivery service began leaving packages beside the curb instead of bringing them to my porch. Nobody directly blamed Evelyn, yet every inconvenient coincidence seemed to point back toward the same office at the clubhouse. One Saturday afternoon I climbed onto a ladder to replace a loose section of gutter while cicadas buzzed loudly through the oak trees overhead. Before I finished tightening the last bracket, I noticed Evelyn's white Lexus slowing almost to a crawl across the street. She never rolled down her window. She simply watched for several seconds, glanced at something on her phone, and drove away without another look. 48 hours later I received another certified letter claiming I had performed exterior improvements without prior architectural approval. Standing in my kitchen, I could actually hear the old refrigerator humming while the envelope rested unopened beside the sink. I almost laughed because the accusation had become so detached from common sense that it felt rehearsed rather than investigated. The financial pressure kept building. Late fees were added before appeal periods expired. Administrative charges appeared without explanation. Attorney correspondence began arriving on expensive letterhead filled with complicated language designed to sound overwhelming. The total climbed month after month until the numbers barely resembled reality anymore. Several neighbors stopped making eye contact altogether. Others looked genuinely uncomfortable whenever we crossed paths during evening walks. Mrs. Wilson from 2 houses down quietly slipped a homemade apple pie onto my porch one evening while whispering that she hoped everything would work out, but she hurried back home before anyone else noticed. People were not choosing sides because they believed Evelyn was right. They were choosing silence because they believed challenging her carried a price they could not afford. Every new letter landed exactly where Evelyn wanted it to land, inside my mailbox. What she never imagined was that every envelope spent only a few minutes there before finding its permanent place inside carefully labeled binders in my study, filed by date, documented down to the minute, and waiting patiently for the day someone besides me would finally read every single page. By then, people probably expected me to explode. They expected angry emails, shouting matches at board meetings, or one emotional mistake that would justify everything Evelyn had been saying about me. Instead, I became quieter. Every morning before leaving the house, I placed another labeled folder into the filing cabinet in my study. The metal drawer slid open with the same smooth click every single time, and the faint smell of old paper slowly replaced the scent of fresh coffee that drifted through the room. One folder held certified letters. Another contained photographs. Another was filled with invoices, inspection reports, and repair receipts. Every security camera recording was copied onto 2 separate hard drives before the original files were archived. Every voicemail was downloaded with its original timestamp preserved. My father used to tell me that memory fades, but documents do not. Those words echoed in my mind every time another envelope appeared in my mailbox. I stopped treating the situation like a neighborhood disagreement and started treating it like a puzzle that was revealing one piece at a time. Patterns began appearing almost immediately. Inspection notices always arrived within 48 hours after Evelyn slowly drove past my house. Administrative fees were consistently approved during board meetings held before appeal deadlines had expired. Photographs attached to violation notices frequently showed timestamps that did not match the dates listed in the official reports. One afternoon I sat at my dining room table surrounded by stacks of paperwork while rain tapped softly against the windows. As I compared 3 separate notices side by side, something caught my attention. The same photograph of my mailbox had been used in 2 different violation reports nearly a month apart. The angle of the sunlight, the position of the shadows, even a small fallen maple leaf near the curb were identical. Someone had simply changed the date. I quietly placed a yellow tab on the page and moved on without reacting. A week later another letter arrived claiming my front yard had remained uncut for more than 10 days. My own security camera showed a landscaping crew mowing the lawn the previous afternoon. Again, I printed the footage, attached the service invoice, and placed everything into another folder. I never mailed a complaint. I never called the board office. I simply organized the evidence. Even my daily routine became deliberate. Whenever contractors visited, I politely asked them to email confirmations instead of making phone calls. When neighbors spoke with me, I made notes afterward recording dates, times, and exactly what had been said. One retired accountant across the street quietly mentioned that she had received violation notices for decorations that had actually belonged to another house. A young couple 2 doors away admitted they had paid hundreds of dollars in fines simply because hiring an attorney would have cost even more. Nobody wanted attention. Everyone wanted peace. That was exactly what Evelyn relied upon. One Friday afternoon I visited the county records office to request publicly available documents related to board filings and property records. The building smelled faintly of old books, polished floors, and air conditioning that had probably been running since the 1980s. The clerk smiled politely, accepted my request, and returned with several folders a few minutes later. As she handed them across the counter, she paused for just a second before saying, "You are asking very specific questions." I smiled and thanked her without offering an explanation. Walking back outside, I felt the warm Texas sun on my face while the courthouse clock struck 3 in the afternoon. For the first time in months, I was no longer reacting to Evelyn's decisions. I was following a trail she had unknowingly created herself. Every document, every signature, every inconsistency fit together a little more clearly than the day before. She believed she was burying me beneath paperwork. In reality, she was carefully building the record that would eventually tell the entire story without me needing to raise my voice even once. The foreclosure hearing arrived on a cool Thursday morning wrapped in low gray clouds that made the county courthouse look older than it really was. The marble floors reflected soft overhead lights, and the entire building carried that familiar scent of polished wood, paper files, and fresh coffee drifting from a small cafe near the entrance. I carried one leather briefcase. Nothing more. Inside were months of carefully organized records separated by colored tabs that only made sense to me. Evelyn walked through the front doors 10 minutes later surrounded by 2 attorneys from a respected local firm and 3 members of the Homeowners Association board. They laughed quietly among themselves, completely relaxed. One of the attorneys glanced at me, looked down at my single briefcase, and offered the kind of polite smile people reserve for someone they believe has already accepted defeat. The hearing room gradually filled with homeowners waiting for unrelated property matters, clerks arranging files, and deputies calling names from neatly printed schedules. When our case was announced, Evelyn confidently took her place beside her legal team while I sat alone at the opposite table. Her attorney began presenting the association's timeline with practiced confidence. Violation notices. Administrative penalties. Interest charges. Attorney fees. Failure to comply. Foreclosure authorization. Every page sounded perfectly organized until the hearing officer looked toward me and asked a simple question. "Mr. Carter, would you like to respond?" I stood, placed my briefcase on the table, and quietly removed a small stack of documents before sliding a professional identification card beside them. The hearing officer picked it up first. His expression changed almost instantly. He looked back at me, then at the card once more before nodding with obvious recognition. Across the room, one of Evelyn's attorneys leaned slightly forward, trying to read the badge from where he sat today. Within seconds his confidence faded. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. For the record, the hearing officer said carefully, "Please state your occupation." I answered exactly the way I had answered hundreds of times before. "My name is Daniel Carter. I am a senior federal civil rights attorney assigned to investigations involving abuse of authority, fraudulent administrative practices, and violations of constitutional protections." Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from the soft hum of the air conditioning above us. Evelyn blinked twice as though she had misunderstood what she had heard. One of her board members slowly turned toward her with a look that asked a question she could not answer. The attorney who had smiled at me earlier quietly lowered his pen onto the table. I continued speaking in the same calm voice I had used from the beginning. "I have not participated in these proceedings as legal counsel. I have appeared today solely as the homeowner involved in this matter. However, during the past several months I have preserved every communication, every inspection report, every financial record, every recorded image, and every publicly available filing related to this dispute." I gently opened the briefcase. Inside were neatly organized binders, each labeled with dates and categories. The hearing officer accepted the first volume and flipped through several pages before stopping on side-by-side photographs bearing identical images but different official inspection dates. He examined another section containing invoices that directly contradicted multiple violation notices. Then another showing discrepancies between board meeting minutes and assessment approvals. The silence inside the room became almost tangible. Evelyn finally looked directly at me for the first time without smiling. In that moment I realized something had changed forever. She had spent months believing she was teaching an ordinary homeowner how power worked. Only now did she discover she had spent those same months demonstrating her own decisions to someone whose entire professional career had been built around recognizing exactly this kind of pattern. The hearing officer closed the first binder with deliberate care, looked across the room, and calmly announced that the foreclosure proceeding would be suspended pending further review. You could almost feel the air change. The confidence that had filled Evelyn's side of the room only minutes earlier disappeared into complete uncertainty. Her lead attorney requested a brief recess, but the hearing officer declined, explaining that the documentation now before the court raised questions that extended far beyond unpaid assessments. I remained standing without saying another word. There was nothing left to argue. The documents were doing exactly what they had been organized to do. One page led naturally to the next. One inconsistency exposed another. Dates no longer matched. Photographs appeared under multiple violation reports. Administrative charges had been approved before homeowners were even given an opportunity to respond. The neat system that had once looked flawless suddenly resembled a puzzle assembled from pieces that belonged to different boxes. The quiet clicking of keyboards echoed through the hearing room as court staff entered notes into the record. I could hear papers turning one page at a time while the hearing officer compared board minutes with financial statements. Every few minutes he placed another yellow marker on a document that required additional explanation. Evelyn's attorney stopped speaking to her in full sentences. They leaned together, whispering while flipping through their own copies of the records with growing urgency. One of them finally looked toward Evelyn and quietly asked whether additional documentation existed that had not been disclosed during discovery. Her expression answered before she ever spoke. Across the gallery, several homeowners recognized my address from earlier notices that had circulated through the neighborhood. I noticed them exchanging uncertain glances before one elderly gentleman slowly reached into his briefcase and removed his own folder of correspondence. A woman sitting beside him did the same. Within minutes, 2 homeowners approached the court clerk, requesting information about submitting records connected to separate disputes involving the same homeowners association. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody accused anyone of anything dramatic. They simply realized that what had happened to me looked remarkably similar to what had happened to them. That was the moment I had quietly hoped for since the first violation notice arrived months earlier. This had never been about proving that I was right. It was about allowing the facts to become impossible to ignore. After the hearing concluded, I stepped into the courthouse hallway where afternoon sunlight poured through tall windows onto polished stone floors. The familiar scent of coffee drifted from the lobby cafe while conversations echoed softly beneath the high ceilings. Before I reached the exit, one of Evelyn's attorneys caught up with me. His tone had changed completely. Gone was the quiet confidence from earlier that morning. He politely asked whether I would consider delaying any additional action while the association conducted an internal review. I thanked him for the conversation and answered honestly. The process has already started. It no longer depends on me. That was the truth. Weeks earlier, I had submitted formal requests to the appropriate oversight agencies supported by publicly available records and carefully preserved evidence. Those reviews operated independently. They would reach their own conclusions according to established procedures. I had never asked anyone for special treatment. I had simply asked for the rules to be applied fairly. As I walked down the courthouse steps, the cool breeze carried the scent of rain drifting in from the west. My phone vibrated once inside my jacket pocket. Then again. Then several more times in quick succession. Emails. Voicemails. Meeting notices. Requests for documents. The first domino had finally fallen, and unlike every notice Evelyn had ever placed in my mailbox, these letters were not asking me to explain my actions. They were asking the Homeowners Association to explain theirs. The weeks that followed unfolded with the quiet precision of a clock finally set to the correct time. There were no dramatic speeches, no television cameras parked outside the neighborhood entrance, and no angry confrontations in the clubhouse parking lot. Instead, official letters began arriving at addresses all across the subdivision, but this time they did not carry the Homeowners Association logo. The envelopes bore county seals, audit requests, and notices acknowledging the receipt of homeowner complaints. I recognized the paper before I even opened my own copy. The same crisp texture. The same unmistakable scent of fresh ink that had once signaled another accusation against me. Only now the questions were moving in the opposite direction. Homeowners who had spent years quietly paying unexplained fees suddenly started comparing records. Mrs. Wilson brought over a folder she had kept inside a kitchen drawer for nearly 4 years. Harold arrived carrying a weathered accordion file held together with faded rubber bands. The young couple down the street printed email chains they had almost deleted out of frustration. Sitting around my dining room table one Saturday afternoon, the room filled with the soft rustle of paper instead of anxious silence. Every folder contained different names and different dates, yet the patterns repeated with remarkable consistency. Duplicate inspection photographs. Inconsistent meeting minutes. Assessments approved before required notices had been issued. Appeals marked as denied before hearings ever occurred. None of us needed to speculate because the documents spoke clearly enough on their own. Within another month, the association announced an independent financial review together with a complete examination of administrative procedures. Several board members quietly resigned before that process concluded. Others retained separate legal counsel. Evelyn attended one final community meeting where she looked nothing like the confident woman who had once ruled every conversation from the head of the conference table. The leather binder she always carried remained closed for the entire evening. Residents who had rarely spoken during previous meetings calmly asked direct questions about budgets, voting procedures, and record keeping. Nobody shouted. Nobody applauded. They simply expected answers. For the first time since I had returned to my father's house, the room belonged to the homeowners instead of the board. Outside, a cool autumn breeze carried the familiar scent of freshly cut grass across the parking lot while dry leaves drifted along the sidewalk beneath the streetlights. As people walked back to their vehicles, several stopped to shake my hand. They did not thank me for winning anything because they understood that was never the point. One elderly neighbor quietly smiled and said, "You reminded us that rules are supposed to protect people, not control them." I thought about those words during my drive home. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. The mailboxes still matched. The sidewalks remained spotless. Porch lights glowed warmly against the evening sky. Yet everything felt different because fear had quietly given way to confidence. Homeowners who had once avoided eye contact now stood together at driveways discussing meeting agendas and asking for copies of governing documents they had never bothered to read before. Evelyn's influence had not disappeared overnight, but it no longer rested on unquestioned authority. It had been replaced by transparency, documentation, and ordinary people willing to pay attention. As I pulled into my driveway, the tires rolled over the same concrete my father had poured decades earlier. I shut off the engine and listened to the peaceful silence settling over the neighborhood. For months Evelyn believed paperwork could erase my home. In the end, it was paperwork that gave an entire community its voice back. Several months later, I found myself standing on the same back porch where this story had truly begun. The first cool breeze of autumn carried the scent of cedar, freshly mowed grass, and the faint smoke from a neighbor's fireplace somewhere beyond the tree line. The old radio inside the kitchen still played quiet blues on Saturday mornings, just as it had when my father was alive. Some things never needed to change. The fence we built together all those years ago still stood straight despite the seasons. I ran my hand across. The weathered wooden remembered the lesson he repeated more times than I could count. Build it right the first time, because truth always has a stronger foundation than shortcuts. Looking across the neighborhood, I noticed small changes that most visitors would never recognize. Homeowners now greeted one another without looking over their shoulders. Board meeting notices included complete financial reports. Residents asked questions without apologizing for asking them. New volunteers joined committees that had once struggled to find anyone willing to participate. Transparency had quietly replaced fear, and nobody seemed interested in returning to the old way of doing things. The foreclosure action against my home had long since been dismissed, every improper assessment removed from my account, and official records corrected to reflect what the documentation had shown from the beginning. My filing cabinet remained exactly where it had always been in the study, but now its drawers stayed closed most days. I no longer needed to prepare for another certified letter waiting in the mailbox every afternoon. Instead, I found handwritten holiday cards from neighbors, invitations to community cookouts, and the occasional thank you note from someone I barely knew. One evening Harold stopped by carrying 2 cups of coffee. We sat on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the oak trees without talking much at all. After several quiet minutes, he smiled and said, "Funny how peaceful a neighborhood feels when everyone remembers the rules belong to the people." I simply nodded because there was nothing else to add. He was right. Before leaving, he looked at the old filing cabinet visible through the study window and laughed softly. "I guess you can finally retire those binders." I smiled back. I hope so. The truth was that I had never enjoyed collecting evidence. I would have traded every folder, every receipt, every photograph, and every late night organizing paperwork for one simple conversation built on honesty. But life does not always offer that choice. Sometimes patience becomes the only path toward fairness. As darkness settled across the neighborhood, warm porch lights slowly flickered on one by one. The same sidewalks, the same houses, the same mailboxes that had once felt like symbols of constant pressure now simply looked like home again. I thought back to that rainy morning when a deputy handed me the foreclosure papers while Evelyn watched from across the driveway, completely convinced she had reached the end of my story. She had misunderstood something my father understood long before I ever did. Quiet should never be mistaken for weakness, and patience should never be confused with surrender. The strongest answer is often the one that arrives after every fact has been carefully documented and every shortcut has finally caught up with itself. I locked the front door that evening, turned off the porch light, and listened to the peaceful silence filling the house my family had built. Justice had never needed to shout from the beginning. It simply waited until the truth was impossible for anyone to ignore.